Welcome, everyone. Today, I have the pleasure to host Ryan Singer, the author of the Shape Up Framework and founder of Felt Presence. Ryan and I will discuss everything around delivery, development cycles, how to actually ship work that matters, and get out of that constant loop of meetings and sync ups and everything that happens to finally release one simple feature. I'm very excited about this conversation today. Looking forward to learn a lot from Ryan's past experience. And just before we start, feel free to use the Q&A section to share all of your questions. I will be checking them throughout the discussion and try to pull as many in as we go through the chat. So Ryan, welcome and thank you for accepting my invite to join us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Happy to be here.
So just to kick things off, let's start with a quick introduction of the framework. It was born in Basecamp, right? So I'm curious to hear what you used before creating Shape Up. What were the pain points that you were aiming to solve with the framework, and just the background story and a short introduction of what it does and what kind of problems it solves.
Yeah, I mean, it's true what you said, that it was born out of Basecamp, and we had this very interesting kind of cocktail of circumstances. I was there for 17 years, and when we started off building the first version of Basecamp, it was just three of us working on it, and David was the only programmer, and he was only working 10 hours a week. And so we had this feeling of how to make a lot of progress with a small amount of time, and this like feeling that that the time is really precious, and we cannot just make something and then throw it away, or kind of have a meeting or go through some rituals that don't actually lead to us really moving forward on the things that we're trying to do. So this was very much kind of in the culture. And when you are really small and you're only 3 or 4 people or something like that, you don't really need a defined structure necessarily. A lot can kind of happen almost by magic, just by being together. But then when you start to grow, then the question arises of, well, how do we actually work together, and who is responsible for which step? And then this need for structure appears, And we were lucky enough that we had a little bit of this. We were kind of allergic to Scrum, just because of the fact that a process like Scrum just involves a lot of meetings, and this was kind of didn't fit with the culture, so we had to find other ways, and then the other thing too was that we had learned from experience that we often couldn't really predict. We couldn't predict exactly what we wanted, and we weren't willing to work the way a lot of teams do, where you make the perfect Figma file, the exact pixel perfect description of what it should be, because we knew from experience that if you try to do that, you end up having to throw away too much of it, because it doesn't actually turn out to be technically realistic, or it doesn't turn out to actually be what you want, right? So we needed to avoid situations like that. So we kind of gradually, through years of trial and error, arrived at a process of putting our heads together, not only the product and designers, but also with, very importantly, on the technical side of things, putting our heads together and really roughing out what is the concept of how this is going to work. So not just drawing the surface of it, not just kind of making an argument for why this feature is a good idea because the customers want it or because it's good for the business, but what is the actual shape of the idea? What is the actual architecture? How do we connect? How do we wire together this thing, and this thing, and this thing, and then that is actually going to be something we can build in, let's say, 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and finish it and move on, right? And so we were actually kind of iterating on this. And this eventually is what I formalized in the book, because we actually ourselves reached that point that we were talking about before we started the call together, that there's a time when you need structure. And actually, even inside of Basecamp, there was a moment when it was kind of like, some of the things that used to happen automatically aren't happening by magic anymore. And we need to actually be able to explain the things that we figured out and how we're doing this work. So Shape Up was very much a formalization of that. In terms of, why it's actually catching on and why it is of interest to other people, it's mainly because we see a lot of difficulty with the way of working that people already have. We're seeing that people think that, when you start to grow and you need that structure, so you put something like Agile in place, but it turns out that feeding tickets into sprints, it doesn't actually help you with the hard parts of how do product and engineering or design and engineering actually interact with each other,
Yep.
And so you get is this kind of thing that I like to call the paper shredder, which is whatever concept we come up with, then we just feed it into the machine, and then it gets shredded into individual work assignments, and then we kind of hope that all of these individual tickets are going to add up to the thing that we want. But it's really hard to do that because the individual tickets, none of them have the context of the overall idea, And so then there's a lot of like, what does this mean? What do I do about that? Why isn't it done yet? A lot of complexity coming up, a lot of questions coming up, a lot of discussions and a lot of meetings. And so the alternative there is what we talk about in Shape Up is getting together to have a clear idea of the whole concept, so putting technical people, product people together and actually shaping how does this thing fit together. And then instead of shredding it into tickets, actually giving the team the whole concept so that they can understand what it is that they're trying to do, and they can make the judgment calls and the trade-offs along the way to actually get this thing finished and in a way that it matches the original intent, of the strategy and the design that went into it in the first place.
I think this would automatically resonate with everyone who is at that scaling phase that you mentioned. Like, we need to have some structure, and now that structure is actually slowing us down, and things that used to work or that were magically happening before are not anymore. And I think also not only the problem with the meetings and constant sync-ups and checking what this means, what that means, we also have that lack of big picture that is not passed to the team members.
Yes.
So yeah, we end up with a lot of people that actually want to contribute. They want to know the impact that they're making, but they're not able to understand that because they're now tasked with something small and something that is just a minor part of the bigger picture.
Yeah, all the pieces of the work are disconnected from each other.
Exactly, yes. I want to understand, you mentioned it was an iterative process, and how much time did it take from the moment that you realized you need something until Shape Up was actually formalized?
I mean, I can't say where from 2003 until 2019 when the book came out, where those moments really were. I can only say for sure that there was a moment around maybe 2017 when it became clear that we needed to we had already arrived at a kind of intuition around what it looked like to do what we call this shaping work before we actually start a project. And we had already arrived at the idea of longer cycle times. So we were, instead of doing 1 or 2 weeks of work at a time, we were doing 6 weeks of work at a time, which is quite different from a kind of a Scrum setup. So we had gotten that far, but there were things about how we were getting through those different work steps that we didn't have words for, and then there was a point when we had brought on a few extra people, and what we were discovering was that projects just weren't going as smoothly as they used to, because there were things that we were taking for granted that we didn't know how to explain, right? And a big part of what's in the book, and also what I've been teaching since the book came out, is, we often think like, what do we do in our development work? We are either coding, or we're designing, or we are like breaking out tasks, or we're having a meeting, And it turns out that if we look at the life cycle of work, there's actually these kind of different phases. Like we talk in the book about the hill chart, which is like this climbing the hill of first figuring out what it is that we're actually trying to do, and then getting that point where we're kind of standing on top of the hill and we say, we understand what this is. We understand how the parts fit together. We can see how it's achievable in the time we have, and then going downhill into the implementation. And what we see is that there's these different phases of the work, from kind of what is the problem and opportunity? Why is this more important than other things? Why are we investing in this now? So more the business side, that we call framing. Then after framing it, understanding this is something that is actually the next most important thing, then instead of just throwing it into the engineering side of things and then hoping that people figure it out, we have this shaping phase of actually looking at what are we actually going to do to solve it? What is kind of if we were building a house, like what is the floor plan of the house, not what is the exact color of all the tiles in the kitchen and all the perfect fine details of the surface, but where does the electrical wiring go, and is there one floor or two floors, and where are the load bearing walls, so the real architectural decisions. So so there's this shaping work of like, what is it that we're getting into, and what does it really mean in terms of cost and complexity, and how do the parts fit together? And then from there, turning that then into something that is a whole package of work that we can give to the team and say, instead of giving you work assignments, we're going to give you an architectural plan almost, which is a little bit like, we're not allowed to have things like that after we learned about Agile, right? Like planning is something they did in the 90s, right? And we're over that. And of course, we also are not repeating the bad mistakes of the 90s. We're not making spec books that are this thick that specify every single thing. But we have to have an idea of what it is that we're making and how it hangs together and how it's achievable in the time that we have, right? And if you give a builder a concept and you say, the house is like this, and it has 2 bedrooms, and it has a bathroom over here, and this is where the kitchen is, then the builders, they know what to go make, right?
Yeah.
And then you don't have to say, now you have to pound the nail here, and now you have to pound the nail there. They can define their own tasks when it comes to that level of implementation, right? So then from the shaping phase to packaging the work and then handing that off to the team, then the team can actually take the project as a whole, and they can determine what those small implementation tasks are. What we need to align on are kind of, what are those 10 big pieces that make this thing a success, so it functions as a feature and does what it should do. But when it comes to the actual 100, 300, 500 little tasks that have to happen, that's actually not the thing that we should really be managing. Those are all the little tasks that come and go along the course of working. It's more like banging those nails in, and it's much better for the people doing the work to determine those things than to have some kind of a master of ritual to create all of these small tasks.
I love the point that you made with the tile color versus the plan of the floor. I think that is the biggest mistake all of us make when starting with that Figma file that has everything outlined in details, and then half of it needs to be destroyed afterwards because it doesn't enter the tech condition basically of the code base and everything.
And it's an illusion because it looks like it's telling us exactly what to go make, but it's only a picture of the surface. And there are so many things that have to happen in the plumbing and behind the walls for this to actually be a real thing. And none of those things are actually being addressed if it's just product and design who are working together to tell us what to go do, right? We need to actually involve that technical, let's say, kind of builder construction aspect of what is possible and what is it going to cost, and is it what we want to do or not.
So if we take that startup example, like going through scaling through phases, how would this look in real life? For example, at the beginning, we are several people working on something. How does the framing versus shaping look like? Is it all done together? Who are the people that participate in the process, and so on? And then several stages afterwards, maybe you can describe your own experience, how it evolved for you at Basecamp. Like, who else at a later stage would participate in the framing? How much time, and what are the activities that we need to do to make that successful? And then the shaping afterwards.
So, I mean, these are really good questions. One of the things that I've learned to emphasize, I mean, actually, I've learned by banging my head against the wall. I thought that there was kind of the way, that like this is
there's never the way,
and actually, because it worked really well for us at Basecamp, we had kind of tuned our way. And if you read the book, you'll see there's kind of two things going on at the same time. There's a kind of whole thing that's more about principles. And then there are some specifics about how we actually did it in our teams at Basecamp. And they're different things. And actually, the way that this can be implemented in teams, there's a lot of different ways in terms of the concrete implementation. This is part of why we eventually created this course now, this Shaping in Real Life course. The real life part is that it's very, very different depending on the specifics of your team, right? And so to give you kind of a short answer, I can't get into all the many, many ways. There's a lot of different dials that you can turn. But a very good starting point is to first learn to identify how these are very different kinds of work. Asking the question, what is the real problem? When the customer says they want this thing, what does that actually mean? You know, how do we know if we're delivering on that? Those things which are a little bit more on the business side and the strategy side, we can start to say, aha, that's not figuring out, you know, what is the wiring of the technical solution. It's more about like, what is our understanding of what problem we're trying to solve, right? And this we call framing. And then there's the work of how do we define what it is that we're going to go do, and we call that shaping. And what we just talked now a bit about how if the shaping is just the artists drawing pictures, then there's a place for that. Eventually, it all needs to look beautiful, you know. But most of the shaping, when you're building something technical, is actually technical issues, right? So so we start to distinguish these different types of work. And then when we see these kinds of work as being different, then we can ask ourselves, okay, who in the team, I mean, these things have to happen anyway. It's not like I'm not trying to invent something here. I'm just trying to put words on the kinds of things that we have to somehow do anyway, you know? Even if we have the Figma file and we just say, like, we're going to go build this, eventually we hit into the reality where we have to actually figure out what it means in terms of the implementation. It's just that usually comes too late, right? But we anyway have to do it, right? So, so what I advise teams to do is to look around and say, when we need to better understand the problem or the opportunity, or if we have to make a judgment call about, is this the priority to spend time and money on, or can it wait, right? Who is the person that we usually kind of rely on to make that decision, or to give us the inputs that we need to make that decision, right? And we start to realize, aha, okay, so framing is more that kind of work that Jill is doing, right? And then we say, okay, when it comes time to actually figuring out, do we understand what to build and how the parts fit together? Who is the person who we usually go to for that? And you say, that's usually more the, you know what I mean? This person is usually the one who really helps us with that. And when we really need it to also be beautiful, who is the person who, you know, and we start to understand, oh, there's all these different aspects of the work that we don't normally name. And we just kind of go through these generic words like discovery, and then, you know what I mean? Like what does discovery mean? Am I discovering what the actual problem is so that we can make a strategic decision, or am I discovering what is implementable inside of the time and budget that we have, or what, you know? So it really starts with that. And then what you'll see is we can think of these as hats, and not just like a structure or a phase in some process, right? And in the very beginning, if you're just two co-founders and you're doing everything, then there's a lot of switching hats, right? And you might notice that one is more concentrated in one area than the other, you know, but there can be a lot of overlap, and there can also be like a lot of like blur. And then it's when we start to grow that we start to realize that we can't all be involved in everything all the time. And especially we can't just have all of us in a big room every time we have to make a decision, and then it's like 20 voices all talking on top of each other. Like this doesn't scale, right? So we have to understand kind of who can contribute to what kind of work, where it's the kind of work that they're good at. It's the kind of work where we are able to really listen to them. They can really contribute, and it fits into this other work that these people don't want to do. You know what I mean? Like, who is good at what, and then how do we define the interfaces between these things, right? What does it look like to finish framing and bring that into shaping? When we do shaping, what are the tools, and what does it look like to be in a shaping session? what does it look like to shape alone versus collaboratively when we don't have all of the knowledge ourselves to do it, right? And then like, what are the techniques for handing that off? The amount of definition and structure that you need around those steps, that depends very much on the scale, right? So you can reach a point where the first transition point is we were all doing everything ourselves, and now for the first time we have to delegate something. That's usually a kind of a first moment where, oh, I'm not going to be there to make all the decisions anymore. I'm asking this other person to build out the project, right? So now you have that gap to cross. So as soon as there's delegation, you can kind of think of this. I've never really described it this way, but it just came to my mind. You can think of this kind of delegation gap. That's like the border where now we have to shape on one side of that gap. If we're going to delegate and hand off responsibility to do something, we need to be able to more clearly define our expectations about what it is that we're asking them to do, right? So that they can also see it as a whole and understand it, and then say, I get what this is about. I can see the floor plan. I understand what I'm supposed to build, right? So it's that moment of delegation where it first becomes necessary to really distinguish between shaping and, let's say, delivery, you know? And then as we start to grow, then more questions arise of, okay, maybe before I had one person who was really natural at shaping, you know? And anytime something needed to be shaped, we gave it to the miracle worker. But now I need to have 3 teams who are all shaping in parallel, or I need to have shaped work to feed 3 different teams. And this one person doesn't have the bandwidth for that anymore. So now what we have to do is kind of unpack what was the magic that that person was doing, so that we can actually teach other people to do it so that it's repeatable, right? And that applies to these kind of different aspects of the work as well.
I have a ton of follow-up questions, but let's start first with more practical one. Like, what's the output of the framing and the shaping? Is it a document that the team gets and then starts working? How does that part work?
So it's funny because we are always kind of looking for like the document, you know, and especially when we are a little bit bigger, we do need to have these artifacts so that things survive the transition between people and also the passage of time. But I find it helpful to first kind of focus more on what is it that we need to know, so that if we were to get together and have like a conversation about, is this work ready to move to the next step? What are we seeing in the work that tells us that it's ready to move on? You know, if we define it in terms of a document, then I can give you a document that follows a template, but there has to be a judgment call of like, well, you gave me the template of like what a document for a shaped work is supposed to look like, but how do I actually evaluate it? You know? So I like to think of it kind of like shaping is not so different from if you needed to make a really big decision, like buying a car, right? Or buying a house or renting a flat. You know, there's this point where you kind of don't even really know what your options are. You're just saying like, we want a car, right? And then you actually start to get involved and you start to realize like, oh, like this is do we want like more space and it's a bigger car? But then, you know, like what about parking? And then like, you know, there's all these different trade-offs that you start to make, and you start to kind of really get in there. And then the aha moment comes when you're like, okay, I'm willing to give up the space because actually the gas mileage is more important to me. So we're going to take a smaller thing. But because it's smaller, actually we can have this one has the better color that I wanted or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you do that horse trading, and there comes a point where you're like, we can do this. This is the one, right? That's the feeling of being done shaping. Like I haven't figured out, I still have to figure out like the exact, so let's say we're buying a house, right? We can be sure that like, this is what we want now. And it fits in our budget. It does everything that we need. We know that we can do it. There's still all of these like steps we're going to have to go through that we don't yet understand, of like how to get all the paperwork done and how to get all the money moving. And there's going to be a lot of implementation steps, but there's a point where we like understand that like 3-bedroom, 2-bath in this location. This fits our budget and our needs, and this is what we're going to do, right? So that aha moment is like when the shaping is done, actually.
Okay.
And it might be a whole bunch of scribbles on the whiteboard from a room that we were together in for 3 hours, right? The thing is that it's one question of doing the work to get to the aha of like, oh, this is actually going to work, right? If we integrate with this API and we do this, it's going to work, right? Then turning that into a document that someone else can take over, so that when they go through that, it'll give them the same aha in their head, where they're going to be able to kind of see the whole, you know, where they're going to be like, I get it, right?
Yeah.
That is a different kind of work. It's like taking the insight you had and then like writing it into something that other people can load into their brain, right? And so we call that packaging. So there's the shaping, which is like actually figuring out what is the shape, but it might just be something that is just in the heads of the people who figured it out. But in order to actually make it understandable and pass it on, we have to package it. And there isn't a single template for how to package. There are different patterns, but the main thing is that I need to think about the person I'm giving the work to. If I'm giving it to a more junior person, I might need to spell out many more details. If I'm giving it to a more experienced person, it could be a little bit more just the key points, and I can trust that they're going to understand what I mean, right? So, and when it comes to the earlier stage of framing, I like to think of the frame as if I can tell a really clear, simple story about two things: the current context and the outcome. And I like to think of it as like almost like point A and B on a Google route, like directions on a Google map. So what is wrong with what's happening today? Why is the way things are today not good enough? And then what is actually going to be different when this project is over? So this is a way of helping us to understand the actual issue that's happening here, you know? So maybe there's we have more and more customers who are coming onto a certain platform that we offer. And because of the architecture, our load is increasing, and we're going to go into a new tier of a price with one of our vendors. You know what I mean? And it's like, because this load is increasing and now we're facing this big jump in cost, we have to figure out a way to do this in a way which is more performant, right? So now, like, what are all the different ways that we could make this more performant? You know what I mean? Like, how do we actually shape a solution to do that? We understand what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Nice. And a lot of this is also practical in various aspects of the business, not only engineering, because that framing moment, it makes total sense for whatever project you are working on.
It's actually universal. I think you can actually use this language to describe any kind of project-based effort where you have time constraints or budget constraints or something like that. You have to say, what are we trying to achieve? How do we know if it works? Just like if you're shopping for a car, you know, we got to go through all the same steps.
I love all the analogies that you're making. So visual and easy to understand. One thing, it kind of made a full circle for me. I wanted to ask about enterprises and how do you scale shape up and everything. And then when you were talking about the packaging, I kind of realized that you don't need to give up on anything that you have as a methodology at the moment. For example, Scrum or whatever you're using, you could use shape up until the point of documenting tickets, for example, or stories for certain projects. And then the packaging for you would be whatever you're using right now. Is that the case, or is it just how I interpreted it?
You know, that's a very good way to go into to start solving it, because for a lot of organizations, actually throwing their agile machinery out of the window is not an option, you know. And it can very often happen that there is a small team inside of the bigger organization that is particularly feeling the pressure and the urgency to move the needle more. And it might be that the people who, let's say, kind of own the current machinery, maybe there is a CTO or a VP of engineering or something who is perfectly happy with the current Scrum setup and doesn't really understand the urgency that this particular team has to start to actually finish things.
Yeah.
You know, and in a case like that, we have to be realistic and work in the real world that we're in, you know. So it helps there to understand we can do a lot more in the shaping phase. And even if we still have to feed what we shaped into a paper shredder, we will get far better results. It'll be easier to match the shreds of paper back together again into something that's understandable if it was really well thought through as a whole plan from the beginning, right? And we especially if we had that technical input earlier, right, instead of after. So instead of just product design and then paper shredder and then engineering is involved at the paper shredding stage, having the engineering involved before we shred it when we're actually figuring out the concept of the project. This is something that we can really do, and we will have much better results even if we're still feeding it into the shredder, right? And then the next step from there is to slowly, and maybe even just on certain pilot teams, replace the existing breakdown ritual where the tickets are created with a slightly different process. So today what you have is sometimes people call it grooming, where there's like a kind of a lot of tickets are gathered for the next sprint. And there's actually a technique that we teach where it's a 1-day exercise where you take the shaped package as the input, and what we output are the implementation tasks. But the difference is that we don't just get 100 implementation tasks out, you know, many small things. We get 10 or fewer what we call scopes, which are like the major chunks of the work that correspond to the actual progress on the project, you know. So it's not just what are the tasks, but also what are the chunks, the main chunks that we have to do, where if product is asking where are we on the project, we can say, oh, the contractor's busy today in the bathroom. You know what I mean? They're working on the sink in the bathroom, and we know what it means, even though we don't know exactly what they're doing with the plumbing, right? So it's possible to improve the paper shredding by substituting it with this handoff exercise where we actually generate kind of scopes of work that inside of them have a kind of a starting implementation plan of what we think we have to do, and what is the right sequence of which of those scopes do we have to attach first versus second, and that kind of a thing. It's a big subject, but just to give a little bit of a hint on that, I do have an article which is called Systematizing Kickoff that's on my website. So if you go to feltpresence.com, and then there's a section called Learn, and you'll see this article is featured there. It gives a walkthrough of what this process looks like, and it's funny. A lot of teams have adopted this just by reading the article, and then I hear from them and like, oh yeah, we do the handoff exercise now whenever we kick off a project, and I'm like, really?
Nice. So that's a legacy.
Yeah.
So you mentioned junior developers earlier. Like, I'm guessing if you have a case of people who are not that self-driven or able to make a decision or plan everything themselves, you would just granulate things more.
Yeah, this has been a common misconception about ShapeUp, that people imagine that because Basecamp has so many very senior people, and also so many designers who are also kind of these unicorns who both design and code, that this was somehow like a necessary ingredient, you know? And it was because of this that we could give teams more room to define their own implementation tasks. But it's funny, it's actually the opposite. It's not the seniority of the team that lets us trust them. It's actually the clearer shaping that lets us trust them. Because when the direction is there, it's less important who does the work, because we all understand what the work is, you know?
Right.
And there's less of a kind of a magic there, right? And actually a lot of today's processes where we don't really state what it is that we're going to go do in terms of the architecture, it depends much more on the individual's judgment. And that's why we have to have so many meetings all the time, because we don't, it's not really clear what it is that we're supposed to be doing, you know? So actually by dialing the detail in the package to suit the people we're giving the work to, we're giving them the conditions to be more successful. And if they're more junior, like I said before, we can dial in more details. And then we can also, you know, the next time we can give them a little bit less and a little bit less, so that they also feel that their shoes are getting bigger and that they are able to start growing in that process as they go through the loop more and more times.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. There is a related question to this regarding implementation and tracking of the implementation. So after this whole process has been done, we just discussed how we would document and pass things to the developers.
Yes.
How do you track the implementation and the success of the project at the end?
So this is also kind of surprising. I've been very surprised by this. I've found that trying to control what actually happens after like a time box of development work starts is really, really, really hard to do. Like if you fire that starting gun and it's like now the 2-week cycle has started, it's very difficult to influence what happens inside of that 2 weeks. It's like it's almost like everything is already configured and it just needs to like happen, you know? And I understand that like we would like to somehow be able to manage, you know, like what people do today versus tomorrow, and are they working on the right task and this kind of a thing. But it's kind of the wrong unit of management, you know? It's a little bit like the builder telling them where to drive the nails, you know?
Yep. Yep.
So the first thing is that we have the most leverage actually in the shaping and in the handoff right before, like on day 0, right before we actually say, okay, start. You know, it's before that that we have all the leverage. That said, there are some teams who are able to carry that principle I mentioned in the handoff of not only having the 500 tasks for the work, but kind of having those not more than 10 major scopes. There are some teams now who are starting to do what I described in the book, where they manage the 2-week or the 3-week or the 6-week, whatever that time box is. They see the work from a high altitude level where they see that it's basically these 10 pieces, you know, and each of those 10 pieces might have a lot of individual implementation tasks, but those implementation tasks aren't the unit of management. It's more at the level of those 10 scopes. And the question is more, are we working on the thing that has the most risk first, or are we leaving it for last? Are we doing the easy thing first, and then we're going to find out when we're running out of time that there's a certain part of the implementation that's much harder than we thought? You know, so sequencing out of those 10 major chunks for, let's say, a 6-week project, are we tackling the right things in the first week, for example, in our implementation plan? That's the kind of thing that we can manage. And we can use the language of the hill chart for things like that. We have a chunk of work that we think we know what we're supposed to do, but have we actually gone the uphill? Have we done that uphill work to kind of unpack what that means in terms of individual implementation tasks? Are there any surprises hiding there? You know, that kind of a thing.
Right.
There's actually a lot we can do. We can have a kind of growing sophistication there, where our ability to kind of keep an overview through the development phase starts to grow. But I would say that the place to start is on the shaping side. That's where most of the leverage initially is, right? And then when you have more clarity around the floor plan of what you're building, then it will become easier, because you will have a kind of common language for the key parts of the project, so that you can talk about status and sequence and are we moving fast enough on the things we thought we should be, and those kinds of things.
And do you have any validation process after? Or evaluating the
Validation
success of the
process.
project?
You know, validating something after is a very, very expensive way to do business. Because the idea is that we are going to run tests by fully building and implementing things. That's a very expensive way of life. I think that that is a phenomena that we will start to see less of now that the macro environment has tightened around us. Of course, it was easier to have a lot of that when there was so much money flying everywhere in the last, whatever, 5 years. But, I mean, any business that has serious costs in their production doesn't work like that. And the software business for a long time has had this illusion that what we make is low cost because it's virtual or it's digital, you know, but actually there are major costs. Spending 4 weeks or 6 weeks building something is that's time that we don't want to throw away, you know. So actually what it means is we can do much more in terms of prototyping, doing spiking, doing isolated experiments and tests in the framing and the shaping phase before we make a commitment and say we're giving this to a build team. Right. And so it's really about moving what we think of as validation to the front of the project instead of the end of the project. Right. So before we actually say that this is something we believe in, we put it through everything that we can to surface the different kinds of complexities or problems or unknowns, both on the technical side, on the supply side of can we actually build this, and on the demand side of is it what people actually want, right? There's a lot that we can do before the project kicks off, and that's the right time to do those things.
So is there nothing done after the project is started in terms of checking progress or whether the project is satisfying the criteria that was set? Like,
I mean,
I
of
don't know,
course,
turning on the lights after the electrician has been gone.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's all of those normal things, you know, but those are just normal things. Of course, we will have a review somewhere along the way. Of course, we're going to say, "Can I see a demo?" Right?
Okay.
But that's just the normal. That's always going to be true, no matter what way of working we do. Right? We want to see the progress, right? Like, hey, like, what did we get? Are we getting closer? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
So
what we don't want to have though is like the review that actually means like we're going to throw everything away and do things differently.
And change things now.
Right?
Right.
What we want to have is more the review, like when you're doing review in a construction project, like for the house, the output of the review is actually a punch list. You know, there's many, many small things that we discovered that might need to be changed, but they are small things. It's not like, oh, we put the bathroom on the wrong floor.
I love the examples. It connects to the question that we just got. So, how are scopes handled in terms of work changing and what we're just discussing? So, I'm guessing that also goes in the framing and shaping stage. So, nothing changes afterwards.
I wouldn't say that nothing changes. It's more that if the major plan of what we are doing changes, you know, we do not have a crystal ball, and we cannot predict all of the very small implementation decisions that have to get made. And there's so many different ways to even implement the same thing, which is clearly understood, you know. So at the level, the way that I've learned to think about it is that the basic concept of if we do this, this, and this, then the feature is going to do what the customer needs, and we can build it in the time we have. That should not change inside of the delivery phase because it's too late. The many, many differences in how I implement this class versus that, or the exact, what's the most performant way to do this query, or you know what I mean? Like, or in the user interface, like the button could be here, it could be there, I could do this color, I could do that color, but the wiring is still the same, right? So so it's healthy if there's a lot of, there can be a lot of change and churn on the level of implementation details, but we shouldn't feel that that's kind of the level of management. You know what I mean? The level of management should be more like, we did a lot of work to figure out how the hip bone connects to the leg bone so that this is one meaningful whole. That should still be true.
If I can summarize it, I'm understanding that we can change things that are basically not documented in the shape up process in the first place because they're too minor to focus on, and then throughout the implementation they can be changed as needed.
I think that's a good idealization, yeah. And there's always going to be some error there. There's going to be things that we spelled out in too much detail in the shaping phase that actually turn out to be wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
There's going to be things that we left out that we actually just assumed the person would understand, and then it turns out to lead to some unexpected complexity because of, you know what I mean? Those kinds of things will happen, but they should feel more like 10% or 15% of the project. They shouldn't feel like the bulk of the project.
Okay. There are some things that I noted down from the research I made on the topic when it
Mhm.
comes to like major usual objections that engineering leaders have
Mm.
for the model and everything. I would love to hear from you what you have heard from everyone in the past. But just a couple of things to touch on, like backlogs, roadmaps. I read somewhere that they're not part of the regular framework. So how are we approaching that?
Yeah, this is so from the standpoint of getting project work finished that moves our strategy forward. Okay. This is kind of the main subject of Shape Up, right? Is how do we do projects and finish projects that accomplish our strategic goals? There's still a whole different universe of work, which is
Mm-hmm.
like this urgent thing is happening and this thing is broken and it has to be fixed right now. This client is our biggest client, and if we don't answer them and do what they're asking for, like we're going to be in trouble. You know, there's going to be those things. That kind of work is perfect in a ticket system. That's why like all support systems are ticket based, right? Because that's
Yeah.
how you deal with urgent things. So there is definitely a place for a ticket system and a kind of triage of what are the top issues that actually need urgent attention, this kind of a thing. Um, when it comes to the backlog, a lot of times when we say backlog, actually, it's like somebody asks for something, we say, okay, we put it in the backlog, and then the backlog just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And when we actually have those framing conversations about what is important and valuable to spend time on next,
Mm-hmm.
we're usually not actually looking at the backlog and saying which thing has 4 stars instead of 3 stars.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just not what really is happening. So there's a mismatch there.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's nothing wrong with kind of collecting the things that maybe we want to do or the things we don't want to forget. And then a way to integrate that into the real process we have is to view that as an input to our framing. So we have this step of framing of like, you know, what is the problem and opportunity that we want to go after next? And we could pull something from some backlog if we wanted to. So for example, maybe we have a really, really valuable strategic idea, okay? But the person who's available to work on it isn't free for another 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have anything else that's like really that important to do, but I need to give people something to do. Yeah, that's a real thing. So if
Mm-hmm.
I have a backlog of like
Much more
some
common than it should
right?
be.
If I have some stuff that people have actually been asking for and it's not very risky and it's understandable, I can pull some things from a backlog and frame them up and then package that into some work that people could
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
And no one would say that we used our time in a bad way, right?
Yeah.
And it allowed me to stay like if I'm in the leadership position, maybe that gave me the time I needed to really prepare for this next big thing, which is really substantial, right?
Right.
So it's not that those things don't have a place. When it comes to, to the roadmap, this is kind of, we talk about framing an individual investment, like what are we going to spend this 6 weeks on or this 3 weeks on or whatever. We do need to have an understanding of what does the next quarter look like or the next 2 quarters look like in terms of the things that we're going to say yes to and the things we're going to say no to, and what are the things that are important for us in our strategy right now, you know
Right.
but those things, they are more directional, that
Mm-hmm.
right now maybe activation is more important than experience issues from someone who's already activated.
Yep.
Yeah. So we're going to be prioritizing things in the next, let's say, 2 quarters that are all based on activation. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean that we actually know yet what specific feature idea or change in our funnel or whatever is going to actually give us that outcome that we want, right? That goes
Right.
down more into the framing work of doing the analysis into problems and opportunities to figure out what we might do to achieve that strategic objective, right? So I actually think there's a lot of innovation to be done in the area of road mapping, and I have some very early stuff with some friends that I'm really excited about. but we don't have anything that I would say is like, here is the method for that, that's kind of
Right.
part of the shape up toolbox. But at least having this language of framing and seeing kind of what work we need to decide about, it gives more structure to the whole conversation. It helps us to better understand how the roadmap is different and where the backlog belongs and what is an input to what and so on.
There is one very important thing that we haven't digged deeper into, the fixed timeline, flexible scope. You mentioned it several times.
Yes.
So the scope is flexible throughout the shape up. It might change, maybe define some minimum viable product or something that needs to come out from that. Let's discuss anything that you feel is important on that topic. And in addition to that, I also want to touch on what happens if we have 6 weeks timeline, for example, the scope is slightly altered. We are reducing what we are delivering in these 6 weeks, but we want to deliver the rest later on.
So this is a very good question. It's also a place where there's a lot of misunderstanding. When people first hear about shape up and they hear about fixed time variable scope, it's natural to imagine that it means we're going to give you 6 weeks and that's the fixed time. And we're going to give you some giant scope of our dreams. and then you, lucky one, are going to figure out how to vary the scope so that you ship something meaningful inside of the 6 weeks, right? And this is just cruel. This is putting everyone in a position where they're not going to have results that they feel good about, and people are going to be under pressure. And the decisions are going to be made at the wrong time in the process. This is not what is meant, and this doesn't work. Fixed time variable scope mainly means we are still shopping for the car. Yeah. And we have a certain amount of money we can spend on the car. And no matter how much we want a Ferrari, if we don't have the budget for that, then what we have to do that difficult work of wrestling with the trade-offs and understanding, well, what can we get with the budget that we have? And that's what's happening in the shaping process. Most of the varying of the scope that is going to determine the success of the project, it happens before we ever kick off a cycle. That said, there is still room in the scope for variation, but it's what we talked about before. We can be sure that what we want is 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, but we don't have to commit to the exact color of the tile, right? Or the exact placement of everything. And maybe we could spend more or less on the appliances, or I don't know. You know what I mean? There's still a lot of implementation decisions to be made. Every single door in a house can be an expensive door with the best hinges and lots of really nice wood trim around it, or it can be a cheap door, So there's a lot of decisions to be made still. So you could call that also variable scope, but that's very different than hacking off entire parts of the value that we were supposed to deliver according to what was framed.
Okay. So do you get like the timeline is always 6 months, or depending on the company?
That's another excellent point. That's very, very good that you asked that. This 6-week timeline, I've only seen it work. Yeah, the 6-week as the sort of standard time box. I've actually only seen this work in bootstrapped companies. There's this feeling when you're bootstrapped of kind of, I don't answer to anybody, and as long as the cash flow is there, then I'm going to figure out what's the next meaningful thing. I'm going to spend 6 weeks getting there. I'm going to move on to the next thing. And it makes sense when you're in that structure. But when you're not in that structure and you have targets that you have to meet, you have stakeholders that you have to satisfy, you have investors who want certain things, then there's going to be much more of this feeling like, how are we going to get that activation number up? Right? And then it's more like, well, we could do this thing, which we think we could accomplish in 2 weeks, right? And then we're going to stop and look around, and then, okay, maybe we could do this thing. So then it's more like we're we're identifying an opportunity. So we're framing like, here's something we think that will help, right? Then we shape, what would it actually mean to do that? Okay, now we're confident that we can do it. Let's invest the 2 weeks. And because we shaped it and we knew what we were trying to do, we actually finish in that 2 weeks.
Right.
And it's not a 2 week bite off of a giant cake that we never can finish eating. It's like we actually shaped it to be done inside of the two weeks. That's the fixed time variable scope. And we finish and then we tackle the next thing. And so there doesn't have to be any fixed number of how long a cycle is. It doesn't have to repeat every time. Actually, there's a lot of freedom there.
Right. And what happens if it's not shaped properly? Like the people from the engineering team, for example, are not senior enough or familiar enough with the code base, and they estimate doing something faster than it's realistic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's different aspects to that. On the one hand, we kind of know the answer to that because that's what we experience all the time now. So we know what it looks like when that happens. I think you also mentioned, what happens if they kind of don't really estimate well during the shaping work, right? And this is a super interesting subject. If we don't know, if we have a fixed budget, and then we don't really look carefully at the costs, then we will be surprised, right?
Yeah.
But if you go to the car dealer, you have to have some knowledge of what do those cars cost, and what do the add-ons cost, and what are the options, and so on, right? And if we talk at too high of a level and we're like, yeah, we're going to just talk, we're just going to use that API and we're going to add AI to our chat, you know what I mean? And we don't really know what it means in terms of the moving parts, then we can be badly surprised by the estimate. But if we do actually decompose it into how will the parts fit together, and do we actually know what we mean by the different parts that fit together, and we can say, if I use this library that conforms to this protocol, and then I connect in this way to this existing system we have that has this interface, we can actually take maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 known parts with known interfaces that wire together in known ways, and we can sum up that implementation work. We can make a reasonable estimate. If we don't know how 2 parts fit together, or there's a piece that we've never built before, then instead of just putting that time bomb into the time box and hoping that it works out, we can actually do spiking. So we can do what is it that we have to go and learn about how to build this thing, or what is it that we can prototype to actually get to the true cost of that piece of the puzzle, right? So there's a lot that we can do in shaping, which involves getting deeper into the technical realities and the true costs of the components that we think we want to put together.
That makes sense. I could spend another hour talking about all of this. Is there anything you want to wrap up with?
I would just say that I would love to hear the experience of people who are listening and who are here now. So please feel welcome to write me an email, to write me on LinkedIn. The website is feltpresence.com, and you'll feltpresence.com, and you'll find my contact there. And also there's some articles and things there. And have a look at the course, Shaping in Real Life. That's where a lot of this stuff that kind of isn't in the book, that's currently where a lot of that stuff is being taught. And also, I'm just happy to have a conversation one-on-one with people to see what gaps I can fill or what questions I can answer, because there aren't a lot of options on the table, and we are kind of all together in a learning process of how to do these things in a better way in a great variety of companies, So I'd be really happy to interact and to be able to learn more how to make this work in more and more situations.
Thank you, Ryan, once again. Thanks to everyone who joined the session today. Hope you all learned something new today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. They were great questions.
Great, I'm glad. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.